we're in northern Utah with a early JK with a 6.2 LS. This Jeep is another California build that is subject to our Executive Order D-818-2, and I do believe this is the third one in as many months that is going to California. The previous two have had their inspections by the California Bureau of Automotive Repair, or the BAR, and the referees, and have passed. Unfortunately, just like Washington, the emissions program is full of ambiguity, corruption, negligence, incompetence, and I can go on. Recently, I did a video that I tried to be pretty goody two-shoes about these programs, but the reality is, it's not. Enforcement in some areas, especially places like California, in my opinion, border on the criminal. You guys know I was an inspector for decades, so I'm going to give you my opinion from my point of view. This is an early model JK. We got torque hooked up. You'll notice that the speedometer is off over 10 miles an hour. We're going just about 80, and you can see it's reading really low. This Jeep is getting pretty good economy. We are averaging about 16.5 miles to the gallon, averaging 80 miles an hour. That's pretty phenomenal for an old LS engine in a early JK. Now this JK doesn't have a whole lot of stuff on it, so it cruises pretty nice and it's relatively low stress. He's also got really tall gears. Look at this. We're running about 1700 RPM at 80 miles an hour. Now, because of that, it will downshift. Like going up some of these grades, it'll drop to fifth every once in a while, but it's not annoying at all. We're only going to talk about California because I come from California, and that is the jurisdiction that probably has the most amount of issues with emissions and the most amount of, let's just say, misunderstandings. I myself might classify it as corruption, public corruption, but you can decide for yourself. I started doing engine conversions in California back in the 1970s. In the 1980s, when the state emission program came around, it was really a disaster, but engine conversions still weren't a big deal. Even in the 1990s, they weren't a big deal. After OBD2 came out in 1996, it really did change a lot of things, because now you have to plug into the onboard diagnostic connector. The diagnostics were not off-board anymore. So it set up a bunch of problems for the emissions program. Because you have the ability to reprogram your computer, you can remove digital trouble codes. You can turn off monitors, and that was happening. And I want to kind of fast forward to about the year 2015, because that's when I was approached by the politicians and enforcement here in Nevada. They knew I was doing engine conversions. They knew I was an emissions inspector because I work closely with a lab here in Clark County. So we had talked about different ways of doing inspections on engine conversions. You got to lump all the engine conversions basically into one group, even though some want to divide it into two. There's cross-manufacture and same-manufacture. And that's really kind of fading away because GM put a lot of engines in Jeeps over the years, and Chrysler has put parts from all sorts of manufacturers. Steering components, electronics. They were with Mercedes, now they're with FCA or Stellantis. So where the engine comes from is really not a valid arguing point any longer. What matters is that it's brought over into the donor vehicle properly. To start off, the US EPA, which is the feds, and the California Air Resource Board both allow engine conversions in their jurisdictions, which essentially is most of the country. Both the US EPA and CARB allow cross-manufacture engine conversions. Here's where things start to go south. As an inspector, when you get posed with a engine conversion or a supercharger, or the guy changed out his transmission from an automatic to a manual, there starts to become ambiguity. And the inspector says to himself, I don't know if this is legal or not. So essentially they're trained to say no, to fail the vehicle. I want to make a quick analogy here to Washington. If you look at the politicians in Washington and everything that's going on today, we are reaping the fallout from their decisions. Whether it's high gas prices, high prices at the grocery store, our safety, the conditions of our city, these guys are calling the shots for us. You listen to one side and they make a good argument, then you listen to the other side and they make a good argument, and you come to the conclusion that it all can't be true. Somebody is lying. And it's the same thing in emissions enforcement. So I'd like to give you guys a little bit of insight from my viewpoint. The Again, I just did a video in another California bill that was certified recently. I did that video from the viewpoint of you being a good consumer, you following the rules. They say jump, you say how high. Being an inspector for decades and training in emissions means I disagree with a lot of inspectors out there, and I deal with a lot of them. Some of these inspectors have only been on the job for months or maybe a couple of years and are still green. They don't know all the different configurations. I remember when we got a BMW or a Kia or a Ferrari, there's certain things you have to do. Some vehicles you have to put in a dyno to emissions inspect them, otherwise you'll damage the transmission. It's called experience. So let's fast forward to about 2015. A lot of states like California and Nevada said, we're losing control of inspecting these vehicles with engine conversions and major modifications. Now remember, you could take a carbureted V8 and put a fuel injection unit on it. You could take a normally aspirated engine and put a supercharger on it. They're all under the same category. They've been modified and or tampered with. So in California, they have the executive order program. The executive order program is basically issuing a law or a rule that says this has been inspected, it meets specifications, it's legal to install in your vehicle. And that holds true for air intakes and superchargers and throttle body spacers and whatever else you guys want to put on your vehicle. It also holds true for engine conversions. There are many engine conversion executive orders out there. When I was working with SEMA, most of the engine conversions out there were same manufacturer or simple, like Subarus or a Volkswagen, you know, putting in a fuel-injected Volkswagen motor into a earlier engine, or putting a small block Chevy into a Jaguar. Relatively simple conversions. Once we get into OBD2, they kind of lose it. Because once we get into onboard diagnostics, we have to assure that the monitoring of the powertrain is done properly on board the vehicle, not off board. So here's what I think tipped it off. Back in 2014-15, I was getting calls from California, guys with Hemis. They had their Hemis registered and they were driving them. But they went for an emissions inspection, come to find that California started to do what's called CVN testing, calibration verification. What they do is they plug in and they compare to the OE manufacturer data. So let's say you have a 5.7 Hemi VVT in your JK. They would plug in, they would pull up the information from Chrysler, and they would compare the CVNs in your vehicle to the CVNs that Chrysler is reporting to the feds. If they didn't match, you would fail. So these guys started to call me and say, oh, they're going to fail me. I want to go to an LS because I know you guys can pass your LSs, blah, blah, blah. The truth is, if you look at the US EPA and California guideline, it says you must bring over all the hardware and software from the donor vehicle. So that means if the vehicle is equipped with an EGR valve, you got to bring over the EGR valve. You got to bring over the original engine, transmission, engine control module, transmission control module, powertrain control module. And it has to be unmodified. You know, for over a decade, I've been preaching to you guys how important it is to keep everything as original as possible. Doing a hybrid, like a LS3 with a Chrysler 8-speed, is not compliant. Putting a Hemi in a V6 operating system where the CVNs don't match is not compliant. Now, if you were able to bring over everything from the donor vehicle with no modifications, including the operating system and the calibrations, you wouldn't need an executive order because you would be compliant. Now, Motec and many Hemis were passed from about 2009, 2010, all the way up to 2017-ish. Now, we got to go sideways here because there's a lot of referees out there that are hooked up with shops, especially shops in California. And the referee is kind of the ultimate judge and jury. He decides what is legal and what's not. It's his interpretation, and that's the word of the day, interpretation. The interpretation of the documents and the rules. So when a document is ambiguous and it says you must bring over everything from the donor vehicle, who's going to interpret that? Some referees were very loose with interpretation, let's just say that. What Motec has done is we've tried to make this statewide. So if you get a conversion from us, you can go anywhere. And for several years, that was pretty much the case. We had over 50 conversions certified in California and registered up to about 2017. Now in 2016-17, I started getting calls, mostly Hemi guys, that they were being rejected. What can I do? Do I have to turn over to an LS, or is there a way we can make my Hemi compliant? And there is a Hemi EO out there that I know of for the earlier JKs if you want to get a Hemi. I'm not sure about the later JKs, but you can look into that if you have a Hemi. But their complaint was the referees were told they were blacklisted. One referee I know down in the Southland actually mentioned his regional manager, whose name was John, who completely disallowed engine conversions in his jurisdiction. And his jurisdiction is giant. It's a giant part of the Southland where many of you reside. Well, I didn't think too much of it till about 2017 when I got a call from a customer. He's a Army veteran, honest as the day is long, a real stand-up guy. Well, he was trying to get an inspection on his Jeep. He ended up getting into a war of words with not only the referee who had called in the regional manager, but with the regional manager. This regional manager's name was John Forte. He still works for the bar. You can look him up. Mr. Forte called me and stated that no cross-manufacturer engine conversions were legal in California, period. I asked Mr. Forte if he was familiar with the Bureau of Automotive Repair, the California Air Resource Board, and the US EPA regulations on engine conversions. He said he was, and he said he was not going to allow any cross-manufacturer engine conversions to be tested, certified, or registered in California. Well, it didn't take long to figure out that this regional manager had no clue what he was doing. In addition to making that statement, I asked what was wrong with this vehicle, what wasn't brought over. First, he said the EGR system was not brought over. I asked Mr. Forte if he knew what an EGR valve was. He did not. He did not know how it worked. He did not know how to identify it during tampering. He did not know its function. He knew nothing. Then Mr. Forte said that the vehicle was lacking an LDP. An LDP is a leak detection pump. Mr. Forte did not know that. In fact, Mr. Forte didn't even know the LDP was part of the EVAP system and it's used for testing leaks. Well, here's the thing. Neither the Jeep nor the GM operating systems required an LDP. The Jeep uses a natural vacuum leak detection, or NVLD, with diurnal overnight vacuum powering the leak test, and GM uses a full-time closed-loop feedback system, which is far more advanced than the Chrysler setup. Well, Mr. Forte didn't know any of this. I asked him if he looked at the VEC, the Vehicle Emission Control Decal. He said he didn't. The reality is he couldn't read it. I asked him if he looked this up in electronic or paper media. He said he didn't. The reality is I don't think he could. In fact, Mr. Forte told me that he was going through remedial training, that he didn't know what he was doing. So after a little while on the phone with Mr. Forte, I realized that this man had no clue what he was doing, had no clue about the laws, had no clue how to enforce the laws. But Mr. Forte put the kibosh on me. He told my customer I was lying. He told him that engine conversions are not legal in California. He would stand his ground. He told me what I was doing was criminal, and it went on and on. So I wasn't going to stand for that, and I demanded answers. I was then contacted by the chief engineer of the bar, Ed Van Mill. And I'm going to try to make this brief because I don't think Ed was that bad of a guy. But Ed actually sent me the VIRs, or the inspection reports, for Mr. Forte and the referee. As claimed, they demanded things like LDP, a leak detection pump, and other equipment that was not required. Now, Ed knew full well John Forte had lied. Ed knew full well John Forte had no clue what he was doing, but he decided to remain silent. This is called public corruption, guys. You have guys out there in charge of large masses of land in some of the most populated areas of our country who have no clue what they're doing. They lie, they slander, they engage in fraud and public corruption. So, Ed decided to cover for Mr. Forte. So did the chief of the bar, Pete Dorios. I'm not sure I'm saying his name right. So did a guy named Terry O'Neill. So did a guy named Sergey Suspin. So did a guy named Greg Kober. And I could go on and on. These guys know their enforcement is wrong. These guys know they are in violation of federal and California law, yet they cover themselves. Now, 6 years later, as you know, we're doing California conversions. despite Mr. Forte's lies. When I demanded answers from the BAR, they have refused to respond because they know they're wrong. They know they lie, and they know they're corrupt. Now, I'm saying this as my opinion, but you can make your own decision. It's real. It happened, and you may experience it, and that's why I'm sharing it with you. The guy that's inspecting your vehicle may or may not know what they're doing. That's why you have to question everything. Now, I want to mention one thing, and then I'll talk about the DCA. One of the games they play is if you go in for an inspection, they plug into the vehicle, and they do what's called a virtual test. They want to see what the CVNs are. And as you guys know, we assign CVNs at Motec, which are distributed to the referees. If they don't see what they want to see, they tell you to go away. Demand your rights. You need to have this in writing. Now, we can go right back to John Forte, who many of these referees have told my customers to go to if they don't agree with them. And we all know that John Forte doesn't know what he's doing. And these referees are not documenting the inspection. And here's why it's so important to document the inspection. If you look at the guidelines, both for the ARB and the BAR, it requires these inspectors to not only give you a verbal description of why your vehicle failed, but a written description and sign it. So by them not giving you that vehicle inspection report, not signing it, and just telling you to go away, oh, you got to go set your monitors, or oh, your CVNs don't match, there's nothing on record. There's nothing you can go back to and reference. You can't make forward progress. And this was the game John Forte played. What ended up happening is I went to the DCA, that's the Department of Consumer Affairs. They acknowledged that engine conversions were legal and that Mr. Forte and the bar were wrong. And it goes beyond that because Mr. Forte had actually held meetings blacklisting conversions, not just from Motec, but from other manufacturers against ARB and BAR rules. So of course, Mr. Forte was re-educated. And of course, Mr. Forte now complies with the law and allows our conversions to be inspected and registered. But that doesn't make up for what he did. And the reality is no one at the bar will acknowledge their mistakes. They refuse to answer. I have sent multiple certified letters, some to the director of the bar, to the chief engineer of the bar, and to others in management throughout the bar. They will not respond because they know they're wrong, they know they caused financial harm, and they know that Mr. Forte engaged in slander. Now, they will not publicly acknowledge that this happened, but it did. So, who responds to me? Well, it's the Department of Consumer Affairs. And what they say is, cross-manufacturer engine conversions are completely legal and always have been. Mr. Forte is highly educated and he has gone through rigorous training. I have to laugh. This guy doesn't know what an EGR valve is, doesn't know how to check it for tampering, doesn't know how to check it for function, doesn't even know what it does, doesn't know that it reduces NOx. He didn't even know what NOx was when I talked to him. Yet, the Department of Consumer Affairs is backing him up and stating that he is highly trained and knows what he's doing. Guys, I'm old, I don't need more fights, but at the same time, you guys gotta know what's going on out there because it's the same thing that's going on in Washington. Guys in control that don't know what they're doing are incompetent or neglectful, or it might even go beyond that. In California, I think we all know that there's agendas. And when these agendas are set, they will violate the rules. Unfortunately, the bar is a bureau, and the bureaus in California are under the enforcement of the Department of Consumer Affairs. Now, I have talked to enforcement at the California Air Resource Board, and they have been very helpful. There's a bunch of good people over there, and they know what Mr. Forte has done is wrong. Again, they do not want to get into the, well, yeah, he made a mistake and he's not going to apologize, but I don't forget. So the Department of Consumer Affairs, who oversees the bar, fully acknowledges that these conversions are legal. The Air Resource Board, who has issued legislation, law, these conversions are fully legal. The bar will not acknowledge any engine conversion is legal. It does not matter whether it's a Hemi, an LS, or anything else. But they have acknowledged they will pass them. You go try to figure that out. It's called a cover-up. It's called CYA. And they get away with it because they keep you in fear. Does that sound like something familiar? Washington. I find it hilarious, some of these headlines. Breaking news. So-and-so allegedly did this. Or bombshell report. This guy may have done that. There is no finality. If every bombshell report we've seen on the TV was accurate in the last couple of years, we'd have half our politicians in jail. And it leads to nowhere. And that's exactly what the bar is doing. They have an agenda, and that is to get rid of you. But the reality is, you have a right. You have a legal right. And you must assert that. Do not believe everything they say. Mr. Forte, who is a regional manager, has educated his referees to violate bar and ARB rules and regulations. Not documenting inspections. Not even allowing an inspection on a V8 conversion, like a Hemi. Now, I'm sure Mr. Forte and other regional managers are whistling a different tune today because they got caught with their pants down. But they will admit no wrong. They are still standing firm, as are all the individuals I mentioned. They're all scared for their job. It's kind of like when the president gets caught with their pants down. There's a whole line of people behind him that are trying to cover their you-know-what. So, when you go in for an engine conversion, you demand your right. You demand a proper inspection. If you fail, you fail. But with that inspection in hand, you have a way to move forward. You failed because your CVNs were not proper. You failed because your gas cap was missing. And I am 100% towards legality, so I will back up the bar on failures like that. But if you go into a referee and he says, well, we had a meeting and these things aren't legal, and oh, you know, I'm just gonna plug in here, you go away for a little while and come back. Oh, well, my boss up in Sacramento said this or that, or we were told to call John Forte. You demand your rights. Now, we do have connections with enforcement over at the ARB. If you have a complaint, you can file it with the DCA. In fact, I think you should file complaints with the DCA if you have any ambiguity, you have been mistreated or handled improperly. And that's not just today, that's in the past, when Mr. Forte was on the warpath blacklisting engine conversions, not just Motec, but other manufacturers. We are also in contact with the DCA, who is also trying to cover for the bar, but they take a little bit firmer of a position. We also have an environmental attorney working with us to keep these guys on the straight and narrow. So that wasn't exactly the typical video, but it's something I wanted to not only get off my chest, but maybe give you guys a little bit of background information. These guys are not God. And a lot of these referees especially are being intimidated and coerced into an outcome. And if you feel that you are getting the short end of the stick, contact the DCA, file a complaint with details and documentation. Now, Motec, we've been doing California builds. It's not a large percentage of our business, but I've also been helping a lot of other guys out, whether it's an early Hemi, or you got an old CJ, or even a pre-OBD2 vehicle. I've been around a long time. I kind of know what they're looking for, and I kind of know what you got to do. So I take some of these calls, and I try to disseminate common sense information that I hope can help you guys in whatever you're trying to get through the system. But I will say this, stay legal. I will not support you if you are not. If you try registering a hybrid or getting it filtered through a referee or even a Hemi without a properly documented CVN, I can't help you on that, and I won't. But if what you're doing is legal and you're getting the runaround from the man because they don't know what they're doing, or they're incompetent, or they lie, or they're corrupt, I will do my best to help you. So when we get back from Utah, we're going to take this vehicle up to the mountain, and we will see you guys shortly.